This is Debbie with Impression 5 Science Center, and I'd like to welcome you to Sensory Friendly Science. This is our chance to do a sensory-friendly sensory exploration activity with you at a time when you might not be able to come into the Science Center. And today, I'd like for us to make marble fidgets. There are a few different ways you can make this, and I'll show you a couple of them. It's a slightly involved project, and it does work best if you can do a little bit of sewing, but you do not have to be an expert sewer to be able to do any of this. We'll be able to make it one way or another. So let me show you what it is. This is the most simple version. It's a fidget that has a marble inside of a fabric tube. And if I squeeze one end of my tube, the marble squishes down to the other end. And it's a very simple thing. This is a very small thing that I can just put in my pocket, and then I have a great fidget to be able to work with. There are different versions of this. This one is a very simple one. This is the same thing, except this one I sewed properly instead of using duct tape. This one is a little more complicated, where the marble goes around the stitching that's in the middle. And then we get to the slightly more complicated version. We also made them take different paths. So this one is my snake, and here's my marble. It's like my snake just ate its lunch that's working its way down my snake's body. And we made some that were actually a maze. This is the second way of doing it, of making a maze that my marble can actually trace all through. And we came up with a few different ways of doing it. Like I said, it works best if you can sew a little bit, but we did come up with some no-sew ways. This is one that's made with tape in a bag. Or this one we made with tape and fabric. And they don't work quite as well, but they do also work still. So there are lots of ways for us to do this. And there are tons of ideas that you can come up with, I am sure, to come up with new ways of doing this. So, let's talk for a minute about fidgets. I like having fidgets. People use them for different reasons. Sometimes when some people need to keep their hands busy. When I am thinking hard, or if I'm in a class and I need to focus my mind, I sometimes have a fidget that I can take that I can work to keep my fingers busy that helps me focus on things. That works great for some people. Other people find fidgets distracting, and that's okay too. Some people like them just because they like how they feel. Other times, someone might need to find something to focus on. Like if someone is worried and stressed and needs to think about something different for a minute, having a fidget in their hand can make them focus on moving the marble from one end to the other, especially if they make a complicated one that's a puzzle, because on some of these that we made, you could make wrong turns so the marble could go over here and you want to get it here. And solving that puzzle and giving them something to think about like that can help them refocus their mind and their energies. And you can use it for whatever reason you like. Some people use them as something you could stick in their pocket. We made a version that could be they would put some Velcro on some of them, that they could be a bracelet you could wear to fidget with. So lots of different options for how you could make these and how you could use them. So in a second here, let's do our sensory audit. So for our 5 senses, how we're going to use them. Start with taste. I don't think we're going to be tasting anything. There is nothing food related in this one. Smell. There's not much smell to anything we're working with. Some of my fabric came upstairs from the laundry, and it smells kind of like the laundry soap. The ones that have duct tape smell a little bit like duct tape. It has its very own odor. And the ones we made in Ziploc smell like Ziploc baggies. But there's nothing much that we're going to smell with it other than that. Sight. We're going to be looking at all sorts of things that we're doing, but you can control the amount of light and the brightness of the things that you're working with. Hearing. None of the things we're using makes very much noise. Duct tape can make, if you use that, can make noises when you peel it up and when you tear it and such. The plastic baggy version makes plastic baggy crinkles. And when you're sewing, there is a very distinct but rather quiet sound made when thread pulls between your fingers. It's quiet, but it's a sound that if you're not used to, can be one that stands out a little bit. So I thought I'd mention that one too. So that was taste, smell, sight, hearing, touch. We're going to be touching all of the things we're working with. The fabric, you can choose what sort of texture you want on your fabric. Silky fabrics can be hard to work with if you're not used to sewing very much. You can do it. It's just a little bit more difficult. I chose soft fabric, so you can use things that are soft and squishy. There are textures on some things. You can get felt that has textures in it, and you can use something like that if you'd like, so you can add textures to what you're doing. That sound I said that the thread makes pulling between your fingers, it also has a distinctive feel to that if it's not something you're used to. So, oh, and there's one other thing you could hear. We made one of these using a bell instead of a marble to see if we liked it any better, and it kind of jingles. So there's one way you can add sound to it if you would like. I think the marble works better, but the bell is kind of neat. So equipment we're going to need. The materials we need. We don't need a whole lot of materials, and a lot of these I bet you probably have around your house. Because we're moving marbles in a maze or in a tube, you need a marble. If you don't happen to have a marble, some beads worked okay. We used some beads of different sizes. We used the flattened marbles like they use at the bottom of fish tanks and such sometimes. Those worked. I liked the round marbles better. You can use different sizes of marbles. They come in lots of sizes. I thought that the average size marble that we're used to looking for worked best, but you can use what you would like. So you can find whatever marbles you have. We need fabric. You can use all sorts of different types of fabric. You probably have something in your house you can use. I recommend, personally, felt and fleece, because if you use a piece of woven fabric, it frays on the edges, and felt and fleece are non-woven fabrics, so they don't use that, and they're soft and generally pretty easy to work with. So if you want, felt and fleece are great choices, but if you don't have those handy, if you'd like to use something else, you are welcome to. Silky fabrics can be a little difficult to work with. Things like t-shirt material can be kind of stretchy, but that's not all bad. So t-shirt materials, things like that work as well. Some of these I made out of flannel because that's what I had at the moment that I was making them. So you can use just about any sort of fabric you have. Needle and thread. You don't need to be picky about what sort of needle and thread you use. This is just what I could find lying around. So I've got here button thread and just a normal needle. You can use whatever size needle you're comfortable using. If you're using a fabric that's easy to sew through, like fleece or felt, you can even use the plastic needles that are blunt tipped, so that you don't have to worry about pokiness. But just about any needle and thread you can find around would be fine. If you're going to try the no-sew methods, you'd want a Ziploc baggie, and you'd want some duct tape or packing tape. I found duct tape worked a little better, but that is up to you. And then 3 tools that we end up using a lot for activities. Scissors of some sort, marker, Sharpie of some sort, and a ruler of some sort. So with all of the equipment there, let's start, and we're going to start by making the simple version that we make with no-sew, with tape. And then I'll show you how to make it sewing it, and then we'll go into the more complicated ones. So, if you look at some of my fidgets, how hard you have to squeeze them depends on how big the fabric tube that we put it in is. This one's really loose, so this one, the marble almost falls without being squeezed. This one, it's kind of tight, so I have to squeeze it for that marble to move. I like the ones who have to squeeze harder better, but not everybody does. You can figure out which one works best for you. And I'm going to assume that you're using an average size marble, but know that marbles are not universally exactly the same size. So I'm going to give you the measurements I'm using. That doesn't mean they'll be quite the measurements that you necessarily want. And you can measure things in centimeters or inches. I try to use centimeters because we do work with science. So I'm going to take my piece of felt here, and I'm going to cut a piece of it that is about 6 centimeters wide. And about 10 centimeters long. So I made a bit of a dotted line there, so you can see the rectangle I'm cutting out here. Now, so here's my rectangle, and I need to take this rectangle and I need to make it into a tube of fabric. And I'm going to do that by folding it. Now I've got a bit of a tube that I can see through, and I need to hook this edge, put the marble inside of it, and then hook the last edge. Make sure that you put the marble inside of your tube before you seal it up. Otherwise you have to unseal it. And you can do that with sewing or tape. And I have here a piece of duct tape that is about a little less than 10 centimeters long that I have cut in half, like this. So here's my piece of tape. And I'm going to cut it down the middle lengthwise so that I have a skinnier piece of tape. And I'm going to do that actually twice so I have a super skinny piece of tape. Now there are two ways that you can do this. You can do this so that the duct tape covers the thing entirely and you don't feel the fabric, or you can do it so the duct tape only kind of covers it and you don't have to be able to feel the fabric. I want to be able to feel the fabric some, so that's why I'm making my piece of duct tape really skinny. And I'm taking my duct tape and putting it along the edge of the long side of my rectangle. So here it is on the length of the 10 centimeter side. And I'm going to fold this in half. And fold that tape over. See, my tape attaches that edge, so now I've got this tube. I'm going to trim off any extra tape at the edge because I made my tape a little too long there. Now I need to tape one of the ends shut so that my marble will stay in. So I'm going to rip or cut a piece of tape to be small enough to do the end exactly the way I did the rest of it. There we go. And I'm dropping a marble straight in there. So see, I've got, it's like a pocket. It's a tube with one end sealed, and now I just have to seal the other end. And I trimmed off my extra little bits of duct tape that are on the edges there. So my fidget is ready. Now if I thought my fidget was too loose, I could make my fabric square a little bit less than 6 centimeters wide. Maybe I'd make it 5.5 centimeters wide. And then this would be skinnier this way a little bit, and it would be tighter. If I thought it was too hard to squeeze and I wanted to make it tighter, I'd do the opposite. And I made mine 10 centimeters long. You might want to make it longer or shorter. Maybe you'd want to make it to be long enough that you could wear it as a bracelet around your wrist. Maybe you'd want to hook more than one of them together and do that. You have lots of things you could do with this. This one was made the same way, except that I used a big piece of duct tape and covered the entire thing. So now you can do exactly the same thing sewing it shut. But if you're brand new to sewing, some of this might be new, so we'll show a few things on it. At its most basic, sewing is always attaching two pieces of fabric together. It is taking a needle and sticking it through one piece of fabric and then another piece of fabric. So the thread basically ties your pieces of fabric together. But there are a few things that you have to do to be able to do that. So we're going to start with how to thread a needle. And I'm going to adjust my camera here a little bit, and I'm going to show you using some pretend needles that I made, so they're a little bit bigger, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing. So the first thing we'll need to do to be able to sew is to have a needle that is threaded. And sometimes it's really easy to thread a needle. Sometimes I just line up my thread with my eye of my needle and it goes right through and there's no fuss and I've got my needle threaded. But sometimes it does not cooperate. And there are lots of ways you can solve it if it doesn't cooperate. There are needle threaders. Sometimes you can wet the end of the thread and it goes through better. Sometimes you can trim the end of the thread off and it goes through better. But there's also this way, if you don't have any of those things handy. If you take a piece of paper and cut a really thin strip, and the strip has to be thin enough to be able to fit through the eye of your needle and be long and skinny. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fold my strip of paper in half, and I'm going to stick the folded end through the eye of my needle. See, I've got my loop here, and I'm going to take my piece of thread and stick it through my loop of paper. Then I can just take this and pull my piece of paper back through the eye of the needle. Ta-da! If that was hard to see, I'm going to do it again with, here's my large needle, and here is a piece of string as my thread. And if you see, this fits through okay, but let's say it was hard because this was skinnier. I would take a strip of paper and fold it and stick it through the eye of my needle, but still holding on to the ends here, and the fold goes through, and stick my piece of thread through the fold in my paper and then pull back through. There we go. So now that I have my needle threaded, the next thing that I'm going to discover is that when I push my needle through my fabric, I have to do something to make sure that my thread doesn't just keep going forever and pop right back through. And usually we do that by tying a knot. Now, how you want to tie your knot is up to you. If you have a method of tying a knot that works for you, go ahead and use it. You don't have to do it my way. But if I'm trying to tie a knot, what I usually do is I take the end of I've got my threads where I want them, and I go to the end of my long thread that I'm going to tie a knot in, and I tie a knot, but that's going to be too little of a knot. If I do this, my knot's still probably going to pull through my fabric, so I need to make that knot bigger. So I do the same thing over top of it, except this time, instead of just tying it once, I do it several more times. I unthreaded my needle while doing that. Let's fix that. So now I've got all of those, and I'm going to pull it tight. Right over top of my first knot. And my knots do not have to be especially pretty for this project. So let me show you on my larger needle. I'm going to take and tie the first part of a knot, or just make a loop and go through it. Try that again. Make a loop and go through it. And now I want to do that again. Take a loop and I go through it, except instead of going through once, I'm going to go through it 3 times. And then I'm going to pull that tight. And it should be really close to my original knot. And now that's big enough that I could then sew and have it not pull through. I'm not going to show you with that because that won't work, but I can show you with this. Now when I sew that, that's going to stay right there. So now I can start the sewing part. Let's cut another piece of fabric about 6 centimeters wide. And about 10 centimeters long. So I'm going to poke my thread or my needle straight through here, and see that knot that I tied? It's going to catch right there. So that knot is pulling it tight. And I am going to just take this and put my needle then through both pieces of fabric. Now, there are lots of types of sewing you can do. There are whip stitches and blanket stitches and just a straight embroidery stitch, a straight stitch. You can do whichever kind you like. This is how I liked doing it best. I'm just going to do a straight stitch, but you can do whichever type you like. If you have a way of doing it and you want to do a whip stitch where you come around the edge each time and around the edge each time, that would work just fine. If you want to do a straight stitch where you go up and then down, making sure to stab through both sides of your fabric. Because if I don't catch both pieces with my thread, it's going to leave a hole. Down and up. Down and up. So you can do whatever type of stitch you would like. You could do more than one type. Anything that you choose to do is fine. All we're trying to do is attach these two layers of fabric together so that we create a tube. So once you've sewn along the long edge and one of your short edges, you'll have a tube that looks something like this. And then I can take my marble and put it inside, and then I just need to sew this end shut with the marble inside of it. Now it's possible that when you're sewing you might use up your piece of thread and need to start a new one. That is okay. If I keep sewing this one, I'm going to run out of thread and I'm just going to have to start a new thread to go around the rest of the way. That will still work out fine. Once I get it sewn how I want it, then I'll just take my scissors and I'll cut away any excess thread. If you're worried about cutting your own threads while you're doing that, you can ask a grown-up to help you with that part. So then you've got your very basic squeezy tube. So let me show you how we did one of our others. This is a similar maze, but it has a frame that the marble goes around. So what we did is, instead of taking our piece of fabric that was about 6 centimeters wide and about 10 centimeters long, and instead of folding it over and sewing it, we made 2 of them. And we put them on top of each other, and leaving about 3 centimeters at each end, we drew a line down the middle. So see, there's my line right here, and we sewed right along that line. And then I sewed all of these edges, except I left a gap right here. And that gap is big enough that my marble goes into it, and my marble can go around. Now, some of my friends wanted to use marbles that they really, really liked, and they didn't want their marbles to be inside of their toy forever. So we did actually use a safety pin on some of these to hold it shut here, so that I can take the safety pin out and get my marble back out of there. Otherwise, I would have to cut my threads to be able to do it. There is nothing wrong with doing it that way. Just remember that safety pins do come unsnapped pretty easily sometimes, even on accident, and they're pokey. So you're welcome to do that as your way of connecting if you'd like, to leave a gap for any of them. So we've made our basic tube, and you've probably got the idea on how you could make this one. So let's look at the maze versions now. So let's look at the more complicated maze ones. This one, I think, is my favorite, where you can move the marbles in your maze all the way around. What we did is we took a piece of fabric that was about 13 centimeters wide, and it was about 20 centimeters long because we folded it in half. Once we folded it in half, we drew a maze, and I used a Sharpie, and I drew a maze that was about 3 centimeters wide, which is about the width of my ruler. And we drew that all the way around, kind of like a snail's shell. So then I had to sew along this line all the way around. You can see my stitches easier on this side. And we sewed the outside edges of it. I whip stitched those edges, and I left this gap right here. And then I can take, this is one of my flattened marbles. And this is one of my regular marbles. And I can put them in and have them trace that maze. And then I can sew this shut, or I can pin it shut, like I had said before, if I want to make sure that I can get my marbles back out of my maze again. So if you're going to do this, let's talk about what you might want to do. You're going to want to draw out your design onto your fabric. This one is similar, except it goes, instead of going around, it goes back and forth all the way through. We did make some of them that have choices that you make, and I think I showed the snake one as well. So for any of these, you're going to want to figure out what sort of maze you want to do. I did also want to show there is a non-sew workaround for this as well. Just like we could make this with duct tape, we made a version of our maze with duct tape as well. We took a Ziploc bag. I recommend using a quart size or a gallon size because you can buy them with thicker plastic than the sandwich bags. And then we took our piece of duct tape. Again, there's noise for the duct tape. And I want to make my duct tape into a narrow loop. Usually when we make a loop of tape, we take it and we loop it this way and make a short, fat loop of tape. We wanted to go the other direction. We want a long, skinny loop of tape. So I take my piece of tape and I loop it around this way. Some people find it easier if you take something like a straw or a pencil to loop the non-sticky side of the tape around. And then I can slide it out, and I've got my long loop of narrow tape. Then I can take my bag open this up. Once you put the tape down, it does not move again very well. So make sure you've decided you're pretty sure where you want it before you put it down. Again, drawing things on first is not a bad idea. And I can take my marble. I used a larger marble for this one, and it still pokes through the tubes I've made it with my tape. These don't last as long as the fabric ones because the fabric or the plastic gets stretched out of shape, and the marbles do stick somewhat to the tape, so you have to be careful. If you get the tape up against the marble, they come apart a little bit. You can also do a fabric method this way. This is one we made that way, where you can see my pencil lines that are not all the way erased, where I have drawn back and forth, and we took our loops of tape and put them on, and then folded our fabric over it, and then we just took tape and did all the corners. I left my openings so that I could get my marble back out again, so that's why they've got the safety pins, but I could just tape over those. And I've got my marbles in here, and I can try to solve getting my marbles through my maze. But the neatest ones I thought were the ones that we were sewing. So I'm going to sew one using one of my patterns here, and I'll show you what we come up with. I was taking this one, where I've got a circle, or almost a circle, of felt. And we had drawn, I'll try to sketch it on here a little bit better for you, arches like a rainbow. Let's see if I can draw it on with a sharp. So I have a circle of fabric that we're folding in half, and we're drawing arches like a rainbow. So I have my arches here, and the black pen is where I'm drawing where I'm not sewing, so I make sure I leave my gaps. You have to make sure you leave the gaps that you want your marbles to go through as openings. If I sew all along these arches without leaving any gaps, my marble's going to get stuck in one of my hoops on my rainbow. I'm going to leave this gap where I drew an X, and this gap, and this gap, and this gap. And again, I'm going to start, make sure you leave a spot for you to put your marble in. That spot that you leave has to be on the outside edge so that you can get your marble into your maze, and then you can sew that spot shut. So once again, I have my threaded needle, and I'm leaving a gap for my marble to go into. And I'm going to start right here, where I'm going to leave this gap for my marble to go through. And I'm going to start right here. I'm going to pull my thread down. I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm going to pull it up. So now I've got my two pieces of thread right here, and I'm going to tie them in a knot. And like I said before, this is not the prettiest way of sewing two pieces of fabric together. You are welcome to use other ways of tying your knots. There are prettier ways of sewing it, but this works for what I need. And I'm going to get rid of this little extra string so that I don't accidentally get it caught. So now I've got this tied on, and I'm going to start sewing this first rainbow. Okay, so the tiny little first arch is sewn. I've sewn that. You can see on the back here, you can see where I've sewn and where the gap is. And I could tie this off, or I can just sew across to my next arch, and I find it sometimes easier just to keep sewing. I'm going to tie this off and go to my next arch. I don't want to sew across because then I will close off my gap. So when you do the maze, you end up with more spots where you have to tie things off. Like see on this one that goes back and forth, all of these lines that I sewed? Well, in going back and forth, I have to sew this line and tie it off. And I have to sew this line and tie it off. And I sew this line and tie it off. And I sew this line and tie it off. So this form does make more knots. The ones where I went in a circle, I just had to do one big circle and then tie it off. So I didn't have to tie off quite as many times. This one I'm going to have to sew this line and tie it off, and then sew the next arch and tie it off. So anytime you're moving your threads through back and forth, anytime you attach something, anytime you start sewing, you have to tie it at the beginning and tie it at the end. And you can, does not have to be a pretty knot, it just has to be one that does not pull through your fabric. You can make it a pretty knot. You can make it a very well hidden knot if you want to try to do that and have it not show up. But it doesn't have to be that either. And if your knots start to untie, put a dab of glue on them. Super glue works great. I use super glue or something like that when I'm doing a sewing project. But sometimes if I have handy just Elmer's glue, any sort of glue you have, most glues will work for that. So I've got my threads here and I'm going to tie my starting point. And when you're working on things, it's also really common to have to rethread your needle because your needle gets caught on things and you accidentally unthread it. It can be frustrating, but just rethread it and go on and do it again and rethread it when it comes unthreaded again. So now I'm going to sew this piece, this arch right back and forth here. And all I'm doing is going up and down. It just has to be tight enough that my marble doesn't fit through between my stitches. And actually this one's going to be a little bit trickier than I initially even said because I need to sew this and tie it off, and then I need to sew this piece and tie it off, and then the second half of that arch and tie it off. If I want my arch to only go part way, I'm going to have to tie it off wherever I stop sewing. And you don't want to just carry your thread across because it gives you one more thread that can get caught and can wreck your project, which once you've put all the work into your project, we certainly don't want it to get wrecked. Okay, so I did my first arch, my second arch, I just did the doorway, so now I'm on the just past the gateway on the third arch. And I really do recommend drawing lines. It's possible to do it without drawing lines. I have seen other people do it, but lines make it a little bit easier. If you use a patterned cloth, your lines won't necessarily show up as much if you don't want people to be able to see them afterwards. And like I said, a pencil works. There are actually special pencils that are sold that wash out with washing things that are sold for sewing projects. But just a normal pencil works fairly well. Just write lightly, and you can erase. Or you can leave your lines on too, like I did with most of mine. And how long sewing takes you depends on how much practice you have on it, and on how tight your stitches have to be. And if you're trying to do anything fancy, you are welcome to do something fancy. I'm just doing a basic up and down stitch. I did the edges with the whip stitch. I did try to do some fancy stitching on some of the edges of some of mine because I used to know how to do things like a blanket stitch. It does work, but I think the basic stitch works just fine for what most of us are trying to do. So I'm going to take the stitch I did before and the stitch I just did, and I'm going to
put my needle underneath the previous stitch, and I'm just going to tie a knot here. And there are some excellent videos online of other people showing you how to sew as well that can teach you how to do things that I'm not getting into here. You can do the same thing with hot glue, but hot glue is kind of like the duct tape. It's a kind of sticky feeling to it. And so if the marble runs into that, it doesn't slide as easily as it does when it's coming to another piece of fabric. And hot glue is tricky to work with simply because it's hot. There we go. See, this is the hole I'm leaving in this arch. And this is my last one, then I'm just going to do the outside. Some of my friends find it very satisfying, the feeling of the thread pulling in and out of fabric, and some of my friends don't like the feeling of that. If you don't like the feeling, you can try using a different thread or a different type of thread or a different type of fabric, because some of them just feel different going into and out of each other. It's kind of like there are many different types of yarn, and there's wools and there are acrylics and there's cottons, and what they feel like depends on, and whether you like the feeling of them depends on your own taste and what you're sensitive to. Now I'm back to this outside edge, and I'm going to get most of the way, I'm going to get to basically where I have to tie it off, and then I'm going to make sure I put in my marble. Because if you forget and sew it shut without the marble in, it doesn't work very well. Although really I could stop and I could put it in here right now. And you can put in more than one marble. I'm going to put in this flat marble. And I'm also going to put in let's see. I'm scavenging. I've used a lot of marbles recently. And I've run out of them. I'm going to put in 2 other marbles. I'm going to put in one teeny tiny one and one regular sized one. And I'm going to have 3 marbles in this one. Some of my friends liked having multiple marbles and sending them in different directions. Some of my friends did not, because they didn't like the noises that the marbles could make when they clink against each other, because it's 2 pieces of metal or 2 pieces of glass clinking a little bit. So now that those are in, I can just keep sewing all the way around. And in some of my spots, my edge is a little bit uneven because I wasn't careful enough with folding this. That's fine. I just need to make sure that my needle and thread go through both sides. If I miss, any place I miss catching both sides of this, there'll be a hole. And any place there's a hole, my marble might escape. So I just finished sewing this one off. I can move my marbles through those arches that we left, or through those arches I sewed, and through the holes that we left in them. You're welcome to make anything that you can come up with. I had suggestions to make one like this with the colors of the rainbow for it to move through. I saw some friends who wanted to make theirs look like roads that they could drive their car marbles on from inside. I'd love to see whatever you make, and I'd love for you to bring it in and show us at Impression 5 or to send it to us in the comments. Thank you.